Yes. Now we're looking at unit two, all right, in terms of labor demand. Okay. So when we talk about labor demand, we're talking about firms who want to hire workers at a certain wage. Okay, colleagues? Labor demand is about firms who want to hire workers at a certain wage. Or a set, yes, the price in these terms is wages here. Colleagues, one trick about labor economics, if you remember the concepts from microeconomics, a lot of those concepts were dealing with goods. Now, here in labor economics, those same concepts, instead of dealing with goods, it's now labor. If you remember demand in microeconomics, demand is about purchasing goods. Quantity demanded, how much goods you buy. Here now, labor demand is the demand for workers by firms here. Okay. So just like our demand curve in microeconomics, the demand for labor is also downward sloping. Okay. On the y-axis, you have the wage rate. On the x-axis, you have the quantity of labor, the number of workers. All right. So there's an inverse relationship between the two. Okay. Meaning, at high wage rates, firms are going to be reluctant to hire workers. Think of yourself as an employer. Okay, you have 10 workers and the minimum wage is 1,000. Okay, you're an employer, 10 workers, minimum wage 1,000. So your labor cost 1,000 times 10, 10,000. Okay. Now, this minimum wage increases from, let's say it doubles from 1,000 to 2,000. As an employer, do you think it would be sustainable to keep the 10 workers? Because if you keep these 10 workers, okay, your labor cost is going to be 20,000. It doubles also. Let me see. So when the wage rate increases, you as an employer, you won't want as many workers as possible. So you might even scale down your workers. From 10 workers, you might drop them now down to 5 workers. Okay, so that at least you maintain this 10,000 labor cost. Remember, the labor cost is a very huge cost to a lot of firms. Okay, the salaries of the employees is a very huge cost to a lot of firms. All right, so when wages rise, okay, that labor cost is going to rise. So it means firms won't want as many workers as possible. So what do they do in response? Firms lay off workers. Okay, then at low wage rates, okay, at low wage rates, firms demand more workers. Okay, if we come back to our example here, initially the wage rate is 1,000 per worker, the minimum wage. All right, and then let's say that minimum wage gets cut down. Okay, although in real life, to cut this, when you drop this minimum wage, it will cause a lot of havoc in the nation. Okay, if the minimum wage is dropped to 500, okay, you as an employer, you can say, okay, now I can get 20 workers now. You hire more workers. Okay, 20 workers, each getting 500 kwacha. Your labor cost is still 10,000. Okay, so that is about labor demand. All right, there is an inverse relationship between the wage rate and the quantity of uh, labor. Okay, the higher the wage rate, the more workers we want. The lower the wage rate, the more workers that we want. Okay. Any questions before we go to the next important rule in labor demand? Good evening. That's a very important point you have raised up. Yes, those things can happen. Okay, it's not always that when the wage rate drops, you just get and hire more workers, because, for example, if you've got, let's say, if it's a farm and you've only got 10 tractors, okay, and 10 workers, the wage rate drops. Then you bring in another 10 workers. It will affect productivity because now two workers per tractor, that will affect productivity. Okay. Yes. So that is just theoretical. Okay. So when the wage rate drops, yeah, you can hire a few more workers, depending also on what resources you have. If you have got spare tractors, you definitely hire 10 more workers. Okay. If you've got spare land, the more workers, the merrier. Is that okay, Mr. Spalo? All right. Now, here's another important term. Okay. When we say labor demand is derived demand. The demand, what we mean is the demand for labor comes from the demand for the goods. Okay. For example, let's look at Trade Kings that produces Fruticana. Okay. If if they gain more customers, okay, let's say for example, Fruticana, I mean Trade, it's I think it's Trade Kings that makes Fruticana, okay? Trade Kings, Fruticana, okay. If the demand, let's say currently is 100,000 units, okay, and let's say they've got 100,000 customers, okay, this is how much they're producing, 100,000 units, and they've got 100,000 customers, okay. Now, if the number of customers increases, okay, let's say from 100,000 to, and let's say 100,000 units, 100,000 customers, and let's say they've got maybe, let's say, 1,000 workers, okay, produce 100,000 units, they have 100,000 customers, and they've got 1,000 workers. Now, let's say, for example, the number of customers increases, it doubles. From 100,000 customers, they now have 200,000 customers. Meaning, to satisfy these 200,000 customers, they'll need to increase production, right? They said they'll need to increase production to 200,000 units. Now, these 1,000 workers, they might not be all capable of producing these 200,000 units. Okay. So, what does the firm do? It hires more workers. Okay. Because demand for the good has gone up. So, the firm has to produce more. So, since the firm has to produce more, it's going to need to hire more workers. So, from 1,000 workers, the firm is going to now need another extra 1,000 workers. So demand for labor has increased now. The firm needs an extra 1,000 workers to make 2,000 workers. That is what we mean when we say labor demand is derived demand. Any questions? All right. Now we're going to talk about marginal product of labor, MPL. Marginal product of labor. This is just the extra output each worker brings in. Okay. That is the marginal product of labor. Okay. The extra output that one more worker adds to production. Okay. As a firm, the more workers that you hire, they're going to bring in extra output. Okay. To a certain level. Okay. It doesn't mean if you continue hiring workers forever, they'll always be bringing extra output. No. To a certain point, each worker you bring in is going to be bringing in extra output. But eventually, their thing, due to restriction of resources in terms of capital, land, and other resources that the firm can has, eventually those resources will be constrained. So the more workers you start bringing in, their additional output will start dropping. Why? Because too many workers and little capital and land, there will be confusion. Okay. That's what the marginal product of labor is. Okay. Okay. Factors that affect labor demand. Okay. They said wage rate. Higher wages mean less labor is demanded. Lower wages, more labor is demanded. Product demand, as we said, derived demand. Okay. If people want more of a product, more workers are needed. Then technology. Okay. Now, here, for example, if a firm, like for example, here, in this example for Futikana here, if Trade Kings can buy machinery that can do work for an extra 1,000 workers, they can still keep these 1,000 workers. Demand grows, they just buy that machine, and they still remain with 1,000 workers. They don't need more workers because there's technology. So you can put here 1,000 workers plus machines. Okay. And these 1,000 workers plus the machines will be able to achieve this 200,000 units. Okay. So technology can also affect the demand for workers. If robots can do what you can do and the firm can easily, robots or equipment can do what a worker can do, and the firm has the resources to buy those um, that equipment or that technology, they won't need any more workers. Okay. So technology can reduce demand for labor because it can do what the workers can do. New technology. All right. Yes. Any questions? Okay. This part, elasticity of labor demand, we're going to look at it after we finish labor demand as itself. Because I want to also go in depth into elasticity of labor demand. But what this means, remember, colleagues, in microeconomics, elasticity, so let's talk about responsiveness. Okay. How now in this case in here in labor economics, the system of labor demand is how the quantity of workers demanded responds to changes in the wage rate. Okay, how the quantity of workers demanded responds to changes in the wage rate. Okay, if demand is elastic, meaning it's very responsive, it's very sensitive, it means if the wage rate increases even by one kwacha, the firms are going to demand less workers and they will lay off workers. That's if labor demand is elastic, sensitive to changes in the wage. A small change in the wage rate, it means worker firms are going to get affected and cut off the number of workers. All right. If demand is inelastic, not very responsive, then even though the wage rate can even increase by 10%, you still need to keep those workers. They're not going anywhere because you still need those workers. Okay. Yes. Okay. And what affects this is what affects elasticity of labor demand is labor costs as a percentage of total costs. If your labor costs are the big percentage of your total costs, okay, let me put it here. If labor costs constitute a big percentage of your total costs, it means demand for your labor is elastic, sensitive. Demand for labor is elastic. Meaning, if the wage rate even increases by 1%, it means your total costs are also going to increase by a big amount. So, if the wage rate increases by 1% and you know that your total costs are going to increase by a big amount, what would you do? You're going to demand less workers because if you know that if you demand more workers, your costs are going to increase, they'll skyrocket. Okay. Yes. So if labor is a big percentage of your total costs, demand for labor is elastic. Any small changes in the wage rate is going to affect your company's demand for labor. Okay. Uh-huh. But if your labor costs form a small percentage of your total costs, okay, even though the wage rate increases by 1%, your total cost won't increase by a big amount. So you can still maintain the workers. Okay, you might even hire a few more. Okay. So if labor isn't a big part of in the big percentage of your total costs, demand for labor is inelastic. All right, colleagues? Meaning the wage rate can increase even by 5%. All right. Your total costs won't increase by a big amount. All right. And you can still maintain the number of workers you have. So the your demand for workers is not that sensitive. Any questions on this one? Okay. Another factor that affects elasticity of labor demand is how easy it is to replace workers with machines. If it's very easy to replace, if it's very easy to replace workers with machines, then demand is elastic. All right, meaning a small change in the wage rate, if the wage rate increases by 1%, you as a company, what you can do is just say that, okay, let's just buy more machines. Let's lay off some workers and buy more machines. Okay. Mhm. Okay. But if it's not easy, if it's not easy to replace workers with machines, then demand is inelastic. Okay, meaning if the wage rate increases, you can't replace the workers with any machines. It will be hard for you. You will still need those workers. Okay, you're still going to need those workers. So even though the wage rate increases, you still need to maintain those workers because you cannot just easily switch them with machines. Okay, and for your business to stay profitable, you still need those workers. Okay, yes. Even skilled jobs versus unskilled jobs. Very skilled jobs. Demand for skilled jobs is inelastic. For example, think of a neurosurgeon. Okay, how many neurosurgeons do we have here in Zambia? Okay, there are very few. So if the wage rates of neurosurgeons increase, okay, the hospitals are not just going to easily get rid of the neurosurgeons because they need them. Okay, they still need them. Okay. Now, demand for an unskilled jobs is what's this? Elastic. Okay, because the unskilled jobs have the labor force is very great. There are a lot of unskilled workers there. Okay, so you can easily replace these workers or get rid of them because their skills are not a very vital part of the organization. So if their wages increase, you can get rid of some of them, and the organization will still run properly. Okay? If your firm has got, let's say, 10 garden boys, the minimum wage for the garden boys increases, your firm can say, okay, let's get rid of four garden boys, remain with six. And you find the operations of the firm won't be greatly affected. Okay? Yes. So that is elasticity of labor demand. Are there any questions, queries concerning elasticity of labor demand? Okay, okay, we also need to know the effects of changes in wages on labor demand. Okay, when wages change, how does it affect the demand for labor? Okay, so when wages rise, companies face higher labor costs. So product prices can rise. Okay, because since if a firm still needs those workers, they don't want to drop production. Let's look at that example we used that looked at for Trade King there. Okay. They may still need those 1,000 workers, okay, and still maintain that production of 100,000 units. So, in order to do that, what Trade Kings is going to do is also going to they'll increase the price of the good they're producing. Okay, colleagues. So, when wages rise, higher costs for a business. So, for a company to remain profitable, they don't want to lay off any workers and want to maintain productivity, right? they will increase the price of the product. Okay. Now, when the price of the product rises, who gets affected? Customers. Okay. Because remember, according to the law of demand, the price of a good and how much we buy of that good is also inversely related. So the more expensive a good becomes, we buy less of that good. So what can happen theoretically? Okay, these are theoretical examples, colleagues, all right? Not always that this happens, but theoretically. Okay. When product prices rise, it means consumers now start to buy less. And what happens, colleagues, now when consumers start to buy less? It means the companies eventually have to cut down on production, right? Right. And now, when a company cuts down on production, it's not going to need as much workers as it needed earlier on. Okay. So what will happen now? The company hires fewer workers. Okay. This is the scale effect, colleagues. Okay. Where consumers buy less, then companies now have to scale down production due to the lower demand. Because the price of the good has increased, so people are buying less of that good. So now people are buying less, the firms now have to produce less. Okay? The firms have to produce less. And since the firms are producing less, they won't need the same workforce. So they hire few workers. Okay. And then eventually, companies also, when wages rise, companies can also switch to machines instead of workers. Okay? When wages rise. Any questions on that? Now that's on the company side. The worker, on the worker side, okay, and this is what an increment in the wage raise can bring. Okay. Number one, what we call is, and this we're going to look at in depth in when we look at labor supply substitution effect, where workers are substituting leisure with work. All right. Remember, colleagues, as you're at your jobs there, okay, you all want to get a promotion. So, in order to get a promotion, what you have to do, you have to work extra hard. What does this working extra hard involve? It involves substituting leisure for work. That's the substitution effect, where you're substituting leisure for work because you're aiming for higher goals. Now, once you get your goal and you become now the top director, are you going to be working as much as you were before you were a top director? No, you're now a boss. So now you've got all the money that you're making. You don't need to work as much as you were working earlier on. You can start resting now. Okay, this is where now the income effect comes in. Income effect is just that you have reached your goal. You're now a boss, and you don't need to work as much as you needed to work. Okay? So this we're going to look at this in depth in labor supply in unit 3. Okay, the substitution effect and income effect, and why the labor supply curve is backward sloping. It starts bending backwards eventually. Okay. All right, here another important section of this topic is explaining why the labor demand curve is downward sloping. Okay, so remember it's downward sloping because of the inverse relationship between the wage rate and the amount of workers needed. Higher wages will demand few workers. Lower wages will demand higher workers. Now we're going to also explain why this labor demand curve is downward sloping with two important concepts in economics. The marginal revenue product of labor, which is the extra money a company gets from hiring one more worker, and the diminishing marginal returns. Remember this, the law of diminishing marginal returns? The more workers you hire, each new worker adds less extra value than the one before. Why? Because the other factors of production are fixed. Capital, the equipment, the land, all right? Remember, for example, just imagine this. You own a sewing business and you've got three sewing machines, right? When you hire one worker, they will work on that sewing machine. They'll be able to produce as much as they can of the whatever the fabric that you are sewing or producing. Okay? You hire a second worker, they're going to now add on to that production. Okay. Remember the marginal product, whatever the extra output each worker brings in is also going to increase. Okay, because you've got three machines, two workers, the second worker is going to bring extra output to your business. You hire the third worker, three workers, three machines. The third worker is also going to add extra output. Okay. Now, what's that happening once you go above three workers? You hire the fourth worker. Four workers, three sewing machines. There's going to be now issues where two people are using one sewing machine. You bring a fifth worker, five workers, three sewing machines. And remember, the sewing machines are still fixed. Let's say the room that you're working in is also fixed. The land, in this case, the land is the room that you're working in is also fixed. You've got five workers in one small room with three sewing machines. You bring in a six workers in a small room with three sewing machines. What do you think will happen to the output, colleagues? The output will eventually drop. Why? Because each worker that you're bringing in, the additional output, the extra value that they bring to the company is dropping. Okay. So what the reason why the labor demand curve is downward sloping using the concepts of marginal revenue product and diminishing marginal returns, because each extra worker adds less value, diminishing marginal returns, their marginal revenue product falls. Okay. So when you plot this marginal revenue product graph, you're going to see it's going to be a downward sloping graph like the demand curve. Okay. And as a company will only hire more workers if the wage drops low enough that the marginal revenue product of the last worker still covers the wage. Okay. So the lower the wage, the more workers hired, which makes the demand curve slope downwards. So let me show you this with figures now. This dropping marginal revenue product. Okay, yes, let's look at this firm here. Okay, this firm sells t-shirts at $5 each. Okay, and we're going to see what happens to this marginal revenue product. The more workers the firm starts hiring. Okay, we're going to see how this marginal revenue product drops. Remember, marginal revenue product, this is the extra revenue each worker is bringing. Okay, extra revenue each worker brings. The marginal product, extra output each worker brings. Okay, so let's say you've got 0 workers hired, you're not making any shirts, no marginal product, no marginal revenue product. Okay, yes. Let's say here you've only got one machine, okay, or maybe just few machines. All right, you bring in the first worker, you're able to produce 10 shirts. The additional product that this first worker has brought is 10 units. Remember, you're producing 0, now you're producing 10 units. So it means this first worker has brought an additional output of 10 shirts. What is the extra revenue this worker is bringing? Remember, the marginal revenue product is just the marginal product times the selling price. So these 10 extra units this worker brings multiplied by $5 per shirt, this worker has brought in an extra revenue of $50. Let's say you bring in the second worker. Okay. Your total output 18 shirts. Okay. So this second worker, the additional output they have brought in is 8 units. Okay, I've just done 18 minus 10. They brought an additional output of 10 extra shirts. Okay. So these 8 extra shirts that this second worker has brought, what is the extra revenue from these 8 shirts? 8 extra shirts multiplied by $5, $40. Okay, as you can see here, marginal revenue product is dropping. Okay, you bring in the third work, all right? Total output 24 units. The extra output is 6 shirts. Because remember, when you had 2 workers, you're producing 18 shirts. You brought in the third worker, you're bringing 20. You brought your output has increased to 24 shirts. So 24 minus 16, the third worker has brought 6 extra shirts. These 6 extra shirts that they have brought in, the extra revenue, 6 extra shirts times $5, $30 here. Okay. These these are given to you. These values I've just put them here for the example. So don't ask. No need to worry about where they came from. Okay. The ones you need to worry about is these ones here. Okay. Mhm. You bring in a fourth work, you're able to produce 28 shirts. This fourth worker has brought an extra output of 4 shirts. This extra 4 sheets has brought an extra revenue of $20. So what we're saying here is this. Okay. If you plot this marginal, let me just find where I can draw this graph here. If you plot the marginal revenue product here and the output, you're also going to get a downward sloping curve like this, which is similar to the demand curve. Okay. That illustrates how how the thing, how you can explain why the labor demand curve is downward sloping using the concepts of marginal revenue product and law of diminishing marginal returns. Excuse me. Then also another important thing is the hiring, the hiring rule for deciding how many workers to hire. Okay, a company should stop hiring workers when the marginal revenue product, okay, marginal revenue product equals the wage rate. That's when a company should stop hiring. That's the you need to remember this. Okay, company. This is the thing hiring decision rule. Okay, stop hiring workers when the marginal revenue product equals the wage rate. Let me illustrate this also here. Okay. Same thing here, number of workers, total units. Again, we've got the marginal product here. Okay. MPL and MP, same thing. Just letting you know it's the marginal product of labor. Okay. So this MPL and MP are the same. Okay. Uh-huh. So again, we've also got the marginal revenue product of labor, which is the same as MRP. Okay. And just put this so that you're not wondering, sir, there's MPL there, there's no MPL. Uh-huh. Okay. And you have this. So let's say this company sells a good for 10 kwacha. The wage rate is 50 kwacha. Okay. When you have zero workers, the output is zero. Okay. Decision, no workers hired. Wage rate still stays the same. All right. You bring in your first worker. They produce 10 units. Marginal product of labor 10 minus 0 is 10. This is the extra output this first worker brings. The extra revenue they bring, these 10 units times 10 kwacha, they're bringing 100 kwachas extra revenue. So since this 100 kwacha, this extra revenue is greater than the wage rate, you can hire this worker. It's okay to hire this worker. Okay? Since what the extra revenue they're bringing is greater than the wage that they're being paid. Okay. You hire the second worker, they're able to produce 18 units. The additional output, 18 minus 10, they're bringing in 8 extra units. The extra revenue, 8 extra units times 10 kwacha, 80 kwacha. Okay. So this extra revenue they're bringing is greater than the wage rate, so you can still hire. Okay. You can still hire this worker. Okay. You bring in the third worker. Okay. They're bringing total output is 24 units. They're bringing an extra output of 6 units. 24 minus 18, 6. The extra revenue they bring 6 units, extra units, times 10 kwacha. They're bringing an extra of 60 kwacha. Okay, and this 60 kwacha, the extra revenue this worker is bringing is greater than the wage that they're going to be paid. So you can still hire. Okay. So until the point where the marginal revenue product, MRP, equals the wage rate, that's where you stop. Okay, because if you don't stop there, this is what is going to happen. We bring in the fourth worker, output 28 units. Then this fourth worker is bringing in an extra of 28 minus 4, 4 units. The extra revenue they're bringing in 4 times 10 kwacha, 40 kwacha. So when we look at the extra revenue that this worker is bringing, this is what they are getting paid. They're bringing less extra revenue than what they're getting paid. So you don't need to hire a fourth worker. So you stop as a firm, okay, you stop hiring where marginal revenue product of labor equals the wage rate.